So last week I gave an overview of the development of just war thinking in the Christian and post-Christian West, and I mentioned also I explained the two sets of criteria, one governing decisions about going to war in the first place, and the second governing the conduct of war. And you'll find all the criteria on the handout that I've given you this week for last week. And you will see, or you'll remember that one criterion appears in both lists. The criterion of proportionality is one of the criteria to take into consideration when going to war and also in fighting it. And this week's lecture will focus on that criterion. In the recent war in Gaza, Israel has been widely and angrily accused of causing disproportionate civilian casualties. And in a recent email, an eminent jurist, who shall remain anonymous, wrote to me as follows, quote, "If in order to deal with a needle in a haystack, Hamas, it is necessary to destroy the whole haystack, Gaza, that is in principle excessive. If the price of destroying Hamas is the death of tens of civilians for every Hamas operative eliminated, the price may be too high." End of quotation. On that, I make two observations. The first is that whether the destruction of a haystack is warranted by the search for a needle depends on the value of the needle. In 1939 to 1945, the Allies destroyed a lot more than haystacks. My second observation is that the first sentence of the two-sentence quotation is absolute. He wrote, "is in principle excessive." The second sentence is uncertain. The price may be too high. My jurist actually wasn't sure. I'll return to the Israel-Hamas conflict at the end of the lecture. Now I'm going to take you back to the First World War. We attacked, I think, about 820 strong. I've no official figures of casualties. A friend, an officer in C Company, which was in support and shelled to pieces before it could start, told me in hospital that we lost 450 men that day, and that after being put in again a day or two later, we had 54 left. I suppose it's worth it. Thus wrote R.H. Tawney, Richard Tawney, then Sergeant, later the famous Anglican socialist, of the action on the Somme on the 1st of July 1916, in which he himself was shot in the stomach and lay wounded in no man's land in front of Mametz for 30 hours. The Battle of the Somme has since become a byword for senseless, futile, if not criminal, military slaughter. In their assault on the German trenches, the British, which at that time and in that place included the Southern Irish and the Newfoundlanders, suffered 57,470 casualties on the first day, of which 19,240 were fatalities on the first day. The battle, which began in July, carried on for over 4 months into November. At its end, British losses amounted to 419,654 killed, wounded, missing, and taken prisoner. The French lost an additional 202,567. and the gain for this appalling cost? An advance of about 6 miles. One requirement of just war doctrine is, loosely speaking, that the use of violent force be proportionate. However, since the doctrine is in the business of judging the moral quality of military decisions made by human creatures of naturally limited vision in the fog of war, we actually need to speak less loosely and more exactly. What is required is only that the use of violent force appear proportionate according to a judgment that was reasonable at the time, not that it was actually proportionate in Olympian hindsight. To take another First World War example, after losing 6,500 officers and men out of the 20,000 who were deployed in a vain attempt to overwhelm the Turkish trenches at Krithia on the Gallipoli Peninsula in June 1915, the British and French commanders should be forgiven for judging it unreasonable, disproportionate, to renew the attack on the following day. The fact that after the war, their German and Turkish counterparts revealed that a further attack would probably have succeeded in breaking through, and the possibility that this might have led to Allied victory in the field, Turkey being knocked out of the war, Russia's being supported and stabilized, the Bolshevik Revolution prevented, communism nipped in the bud, and the anti-Bolshevism that helped to engender Nazism aborted, none of those render the judgment in the circumstances of the time any less reasonable and morally right. So according to the doctrine of just war, a political decision to embark on a war and to keep on prosecuting it, and a military decision to launch and continue an operation are both required to appear proportionate according to what one may reasonably expect the decision makers to have made at the time. But why is proportionality important, and what does it mean in practice? As I see it, the purpose of the criterion is to have the use of violence governed by the appropriate moral ends, partly to limit the damage caused, and partly to provide a way of measuring the sincerity of the intention. If the violence used is not proportionate to one's purported end, then there is prima facie reason to doubt what is purported. In other words, if I'm aiming to achieve a certain military objective and I cause far more damage than is necessary to achieve my objective, the question arises, what was my objective? Accordingly, one is only justified in embarking upon a war or continuing to fight it if the terrible evils it entails are worth it in some sense. That is, if inflicting and suffering them are made worthwhile by the just peace one hopes reasonably to gain thereby. And one is only justified in launching a military operation or persisting in it if the losses to one's own side are made worthwhile, in some sense, by the military advantages one hopes reasonably to gain thereby. The criterion of proportionality therefore rules against the resort to violence that is less governed by the constructive intention of just peace than, for example, driven by the annihilating motives of revenge or hatred. And it also rules against military operations that appear to be imprudently expensive of human lives. Its purpose is to keep declared intention honest and to subject the use of violence to the service of moral ends, thereby reining in its destructiveness. The criterion of proportionality therefore does rule against the use of certain kinds of violence in certain circumstances, and insofar as it is applied, it serves to save many human lives. Nonetheless, it still allows killing on a very grand scale indeed. Let's go back to the Somme. The expense of 622,221 Allied casualties might well seem a grossly disproportionate price to pay for an advance of 6 miles or so. But that, however, was not the only gain. The attack on the Somme had been launched in part to relieve the severe pressure to which the French were being subjected at Verdun, by forcing the enemy to redeploy troops northwards. This it succeeded in doing, at the same time confirming the Anglo-French alliance upon which successful resistance to the German invasion depended. So there was a political gain as well. Its main and original military aim, however, was to contribute to a concerted effort on both the western and eastern fronts to exhaust Germany's reserves. This it also achieved. If the Somme cost the Allies dearly, it also drained the Germans, who, though defending, probably suffered more than 500,000, but less than 600,000 casualties. One German officer described the Somme as, quote, the muddy grave of the German army. And Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria observed that, quote, what remained of the old first-class peace-trained German infantry had been expended on the battlefield. It was the first time on the Western Front that the Allies had seized the initiative, and the experience of the Somme left the Germans considerably more shaken than the British. At the end of 1916, according to his memoirs, General Erich Ludendorff, who was in effect deputy of the Chief of the General Staff, warned the German High Command too, and I quote, bear in mind that the enemy's great superiority in men and material would be even more painfully felt in 1917 than in 1916. They had to face the danger that Somme fighting would soon break out at various points on our fronts, and that even our troops would not be able to withstand such attacks indefinitely, especially if the enemy gave us no time for rest and for the accumulation of material. Our position was uncommonly difficult and a way out hard to find. We could not contemplate an offensive ourselves, having to keep our reserves available for defence. If the war lasted, our defeat seemed inevitable. The following February, the Germans abandoned their positions on the Somme and retreated up to 20 miles backwards to the Siegfriedstellung or Hindenburg Line. Richard Tawney can be forgiven for wondering whether the 93% casualties sustained by his battalion and the sudden violent destruction of so many friends and colleagues was worth it. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army achieved very, very few of its tactical objectives at a very, very high cost. Nevertheless, over the next 4 months, it won valuable strategic and political gains. Many contemporary historians would agree with the judgment of Charles E.W. Bean, the famous Australian war correspondent and historian, that, and I quote, it's true that the Somme offensive relieved Verdun, prevented the transfer of more than a few divisions to the Eastern Front, and strained the morale of German divisions. It's beyond doubt that in this battle a considerable part of the German forces reached and passed their zenith of endurance. A decline of morale was evident to all its opponents in the last stage of the offensive and is admitted by German historians. On the other hand, the new British Army acquired confidence and experience. To this extent, the battle marked a definite step toward the winning of the war. Nevertheless, there remains the question of whether the Somme's gains were outweighed by its dreadful losses. As Bean continues, but the cost was dangerously high. The question must arise whether so disproportionate an expenditure of manpower was necessary, and whether the same ends could not have been better attained by different means. Note again, the question is asked. The answer is not given. This has long been controversial, and it still is. A common perception is that the British Commander-in-Chief, General Sir Douglas Haig, was callously profligate with the lives of his own troops. Certainly, this is the view of some contemporary moral and political philosophers who have commented on the subject. A.J. Coates, for example, writes that in the end, it is a suspicion not so much of military incompetence as of callous indifference that lies behind the moral criticism of Haig's leadership, the suspicion that he was able to take the decisions he did only because he'd lost sight of their human cost. And although he doesn't refer to anyone in particular, the Australian moral philosopher, Catholic moral philosopher C.A.J. Cody, gives no reason to suppose that he would exempt Haig from his general indictment of military leadership in the First World War. And I quote, "Part of the widespread moral revulsion from the dreadful conflict of World War I is produced by the perception that there was a callous disregard by the General Staff of both armies for the well-being of their own troops. I lack the expertise to be confident about the validity of this perception, though I suspect that it is accurate. Certainly, the generals seldom got close enough to the conflict to gain any sense of what their policies were inflicting upon the men, and they displayed an attitude toward the wastage of human life that suggested they viewed the troops as mere cannon fodder. It has been claimed that the frightful stalemate of trench warfare was forced upon them by circumstance, and that no other tactics were available to fight the war. I doubt this is so. Had the General Staff viewed the wastage of life as the moral enormity it has subsequently come to seem, they would have exercised more imagination in trying to find other ways of fighting. On the other hand, if no other methods were available or devisable, this surely constituted a reason to make urgent efforts to negotiate a settlement." Now, just to give you a clue, the way I'm going to respond to that is to say that these philosophers, first of all, don't understand what warfighting involves, and their grasp of the historical circumstance in this case was loose. My first response to these charges is to distinguish callousness from indifference or carelessness. There is a sense in which any military commander who's going to do his job has to be able to callous himself, to thicken his skin. And actually, this applies to anybody in a position of leadership. When you have to do things and decide things that you know will harm people, you can't allow your decision-making to be overcome by your acute sensitivity to the harm that will follow from your decisions. Harm you don't intend, but you can't avoid. Any military commander has to be emotionally capable of ordering his troops to risk their lives, and in some cases, capable of ordering them to their probable or certain deaths. Moreover, the doctrine of just war requires some prospect of success, and history suggests, I think, that successful military commanders are those who are calloused enough to be ruthless in what they demand of their own troops. Take this example from the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, which was the first and last major land success that British imperial troops alone achieved against German forces in the Second World War. In the middle of the battle, the New Zealand Major General Freyberg held a briefing conference at which he communicated General Bernard Montgomery's orders to Brigadier John Curry, commander of the 9th Armoured Brigade. And this is how Barry Pitt describes the conference. The task for 9th Armoured Brigade to advance past the infantry objective, break through the enemy defences, and immediately beyond the Rahman track, and then hold open the gap against enemy counterattacks until the heavy brigades of the 1st Armoured Division had gone through, was so obviously one of difficulty and danger that when Curry's time came to make comment, he rather diffidently suggested that by the end of the day, his brigade might well have suffered 50% casualties. To this, Freyberg had replied with studied nonchalance. Perhaps more than that, the Army Commander Montgomery says he's prepared to accept 100%. Was Montgomery callous? In a certain militarily necessary sense, yes, he was. Was he careless of the lives of his troops? Not at all. On the contrary, Montgomery was a highly popular commander because while he was willing to spend his soldiers' lives, he was careful not to waste them. And he was also careful to make sure that his men understood what was being asked of them and why. Montgomery had been in the trenches in the First World War, and he resolved to plan thoroughly to minimize wastage. But he was still prepared to accept 100% casualties in certain cases. To be just, a war has to have some prospect of success. To be successful, a military commander must be sufficiently calloused to spend the lives of his troops. Such callousness can accompany carefulness, but can it also accompany compassion, as A.J. Coates would require? In one colloquial sense, the answer has to be no, for compassion connotes a certain emotional identification and entering into the suffering of others, which is exactly what a commander must callous himself against if he is to order his troops to risk or spend their lives. In the midst of battle, he can't afford compassion of this sort if he is to make a success of his job. This callousness, however, is perfectly compatible with having such sympathy for the plight of frontline troops before battle or for the plight of the wounded afterwards as to make sure that they have what they need. I offer this summary: carefulness before battle, callousness in it, compassion after it. Back to the Somme and General Haig. Was Haig callous? Did he treat his own soldiers, quote, as the merest cannon fodder? Well, Haig was characteristically taciturn and outwardly impassive, as Victorian gentlemen, especially Scottish Victorian gentlemen, were wont to be. But Haig was not insensible of the plight of his men. Contrary to popular myth and to Cody's understanding, he did get close enough to the front line to witness the effects of his policies upon the men required to carry them out. He visited the trenches, was appalled by what he saw, and took steps to improve his troops' lot by ordering the construction of a vast infrastructure of canteens, baths, and the like. Further, during the Great War, he felt the losses among his men deeply, took great care of his wounded, and according to his son, would have visited field hospitals more frequently had the sight of them not made him physically ill. According to one account, he only stopped his hospital visits on the urging of his staff officers. After the war, he devoted the better part of his time to working for the cause of war veterans through the British Legion. Douglas Haig did not view his men as mere cannon fodder. There is one sense, however, in which it could make good sense to say that the Somme was disproportionate, in the sense of being worthless, namely, if it was part of a war that should never have been fought in the first place. If a war can't meet the moral requirements governing the decision to enter it, then we can say with certainty that all its costs are disproportionate. If Britain's opposing the German invasion of Belgium and France was unjustified, then it was worth no casualties at all. I don't have time here to explain why I judge that Britain's entry into the First World War was in fact morally justified. Indeed, I think it was morally obligatory. If you want to read my explanation, I'll refer you to chapter 4 of my 2013 book, In Defense of War. But just to explain very briefly, if you study the deliberations of the British cabinet in the days running up to their decision to go to war, you will see the cabinet was not at all keen to go to war. The issue hinged on what Britain's moral obligations were to the French, and also since Germany had invaded Belgium, whose neutrality was guaranteed by international law, by, among others, Britain, there's also a question of Britain's legal obligations. Many cabinet members argued against entering the war, but the cabinet was carried in favour of Britain's moral obligation to aid France against an unprovoked attack. But if you want to know more, then chapter 4 of In Defence of War will give it to you. So in sum, what does Britain's involvement in the war against Germany in 1914 to 18 teach us about the criterion of proportionality? Three things, I think. Most basically, it reminds us that humans are creatures, not gods. We lack perfect vision, especially in the fog of war. Therefore, moral judgments of military decisions should be made in terms of what the human decision maker can reasonably be expected to have known and done, given the unforgiving pressure of time and circumstance. And if a large number of military lives are lost in vain, notwithstanding careful, conscientious calculation, the decision maker should not be blamed, and the loss should not be considered disproportionate in a moral sense, that is, in the sense relevant to the judgment of the rightness or wrongness of decisions made by moral agents. In war, lots of military lives are lost, not through culpable negligence, but through honest mistakes and sheer bad luck. Consequently, second, the idea, which is very common, that one should determine proportionality through a cost-benefit analysis is beyond the competence of human creatures. We don't have perfect vision of the future. We can perhaps estimate accurately the immediate consequences of what we intend to do. Beyond that, however, factors multiply and combine in ways we never anticipated or could anticipate, and the effects of our actions run quickly out of our control. How on earth, for example, could the British government in August 1914 be expected, as Anthony Coates requires, to have calculated the effects of a decision to go to war not only upon all the belligerents, but also upon neutral countries, and indeed on, quote, the international community as a whole? How would you do that? Moreover, the benefits and costs, the goods and evils, are of such different kinds that one cannot rationally measure them against each other. How much upholding of international law and order, how much moral obligation to a neighbour invaded without provocation? How much Belgian and French liberation from severe German oppression is worth how many lives? Give me a figure. Can't do it. To take another example from the Second World War, in 2010 the BBC dramatised the memoirs of a Battle of Britain pilot, Geoffrey Wellham. At the end of the dramatisation, which is well worth seeing if you can find it, at the end of the dramatisation, the real 90-year-old Wellham appeared looking out over the iconic white cliffs of Dover. And as he gazed out to sea, he said, "Was it worth it? Was it worth it? All those young men I fought and flew with, all those chaps who are no longer with us? I suppose it must have been. I'm still struggling with that." Did Wellham mean that he doubted Britain should have fought against Hitler in 1940? I don't think so. Rather, I think he was giving voice to the truth that the loss of each life is an absolute loss for which there is no compensation. I think, was it worth it, is the wrong question, because there's no sensible way of answering it. Such a weighing up of goods and evils can't be done. That's my second conclusion from reflecting on proportionality in the First World War. And the third, more briefly, is simply we should learn from Britain's involvement in the First World War and the Battle of El Alamein in 1942 that the expenditure of a very large number of military lives is not in itself a sure sign of disproportion. So if we shouldn't think of proportionality in terms simply of a large number or an excess of a large number or as an excess of benefits over costs, how should we think of it? One sensible way is in terms of military action that is not counterproductive or self-subversive. So proportionate action is not counterproductive. Or if you like, disproportionate action is counterproductive or self-subversive. So for NATO to have gone to war against Russia in 1956 to save the Hungarians, or in 1968 to save the Czechs, or even in 2014 or 22 to save the Ukrainians, and to risk world-destroying nuclear war would have been to undercut its goal, a free and flourishing Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Ukraine. Thus, too, to engage in military operations that result in large-scale civilian deaths when a vital part of the overall counterinsurgency strategy is to win civilian hearts and minds would be to undercut the very goal one is supposed to serve. In both these cases, military action would be self-subverting and in that sense disproportionate. That makes sense. But it also suggests a further understanding of proportionality that makes sense, one that operates in terms of aptness. And I find this the most plausible. The military means chosen should be apt or appropriate to the ends they're supposed to serve. And according to just war reasoning, those ends are ultimately political, since justified war must always intend a sufficiently just and stable peace. And here I bring us to Gaza. And the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Many people seem to think that the state of Israel is fundamentally illegitimate and that therefore no costs incurred, no damage inflicted in its self-defense can be justified. Accordingly, the day after Hamas's atrocious attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023, Dr. Shahd Hamouri, lecturer in international law at the University of Kent, posted on Instagram her view that, quote, resistance by the Palestinian people by all means available is a legitimate act. 2 months later, on Al Jazeera's website, she explained herself in terms of Israel's settler colonialism. Quote, everything that is happening now in Israel-Palestine is taking place within the context of colonization, occupation, and apartheid. Israel is a colonizing power, and the Palestinians are the colonized indigenous population. That is the distorted, morally simplistic, decolonizing melodrama. Here is the complicated truth about the foundation of the State of Israel. In the decades before 1914, when Palestine was under Ottoman rule, Jewish corporations bought land from Arab landlords for tens of thousands of Zionist immigrants to settle on. Many of the latter were refugees fleeing murderous pogroms in Russia. Partly because of the ethnic character of Zionist ideology, and partly because people understandably prefer to live among those they trust, sharing similar cultural backgrounds and language, the Zionist immigrants preferred to build their new agricultural settlements with fellow Zionists. Accordingly, they let go of the long-standing Arab tenants they had inherited. Naturally, the Arabs resented this. Yet, not clearly unjust, their displacement was perfectly legal. But it was also tragic, bound to excite racial ill-feeling. But whatever our evaluation, this case of European colonization, like so many others, was no stereotypical invasion. In 1917, the British government made the Balfour Declaration, pledging to support the establishment of, quote, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, without prejudice to the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. Among the reasons for the declaration were genuine sympathy for the Zionist story of an exiled people yearning to return to its homeland. It is widely believed that the declaration betrayed a promise made in 1915 to Hussein, Sharif of Mecca, that Britain would help to set up an Arab state that encompassed Palestine. But there was no betrayal. The British did establish two Arab states, Jordan and Iraq. And as Eli Kaduri argues persuasively, I think, in his 1976 book, In the Anglo-Arab Labyrinth, they had not promised to include Palestine. But that remains a point of continuing controversy. After the end of the First World War, the League of Nations mandated Britain to administer Palestine so as to build a new independent state and a Jewish homeland out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. The exact form of that national home was left undetermined. During the mandate's quarter of a century, from 1923 to 1947, the British tried a variety of permutations to satisfy the interests of both Jew and Arab. A semi-autonomous Jewish province within a larger Arab state, a Jewish state within an Arab federation, and a binational state. However, notwithstanding their long imperial experience of managing multicultural politics, the British had gravely underestimated the difficulty of constructing from scratch a viable polity out of cultures as widely divergent as those of European Jewry and Middle Eastern Arabs. None of the political options put on the table proved acceptable to both sides. British frustration was well expressed by Ronald Storrs, governor of Jerusalem from 1917 to 26, when he wrote in his 1939 Orientations, and I quote, "2 hours of Arab grievance drive me into the synagogue, while after an intensive course of Zionist propaganda, I'm prepared to embrace Islam." Arab frustration had burst into violence in April 1920 when riots in Jerusalem during the Nebi Musa festival left 5 Jews dead and 216 wounded. Further riots followed in the 1920s, culminating in the Arab Revolt of 1936-9. While the immediate motive was anti-Zionist, it was not untainted by historic anti-Semitism. One instigator of the Nebi Musa riots, who became the leader of Arab resistance, Haj Amin al-Husseini, ended up in Nazi Germany in 1938, where, as Ilan Pappy coyly puts it, he confused the distinction between Judaism and Zionism. In order to ameliorate Arab grievances, the British considered restricting Jewish immigration in 1930, but decided against it, partly because of sympathy for Jews seeking refuge from anti-Semitism in Germany. When the British did impose a limit in 1939, the Zionist terrorist group Lehi sought an alliance with Hitler to oust them. The British became increasingly exasperated by their failure to broker a compromise while being subjected to violence from both sides. And when in November 1947 the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and the other Arab, the British government abstained. Afterwards, it decided it was unwilling to take responsibility for the practical result, and the following May, Britain surrendered its mandate and withdrew. At that point, Jews occupied only 10% of Palestinian territory. However, when invading Arab armies failed to crush the nascent state of Israel in 1948-9, some 750,000 Arabs fled Palestine, abandoning their land. How far they left, or how far they were pushed, remains controversial. Some reckon half were deliberately expelled. Yet ethnic cleansing was undertaken by both sides. When Arab troops occupied Jerusalem, Jews were forced out, and about 900,000 more were driven from Arab countries, most seeking refuge in Israel. So that's the whole morally messy truth about the founding of the State of Israel. It involved victims and villains on both sides and a lot of human tragedy. The cartoonish decolonization narrative of wicked Zionist settlers versus innocent Arab indigenes does not begin to do justice to the past, and it authorizes unrestrained, even genocidal violence on the part of Hamas in the present. Indeed, it authorizes violence that, being completely untethered to any feasible political process leading to a just peace, is surely disproportionate on the part of Hamas. Whatever injustices Palestinian Arabs have suffered, however illegitimate one considers the Israeli settlements on the West Bank, and I do, and however critically one judges the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, the intentionally and sadistically indiscriminate slaughter of over 1,100 men, women and children, on the 7th of October 23 had no moral justification in the eyes of the just war tradition. Accordingly, Israel was clearly justified in taking military action to defend its people by rendering Hamas incapable of repeating what it did. However, since Hamas deliberately chose to operate out of a densely populated urban area, building underground tunnels for its combatants, but not shelters for non-combatants, the costs imposed upon civilians by Israel's military retaliation have been enormous. The number of civilian casualties to date is horrifically high. According to a Reuters report on the 15th of January of this year, 2025, the Ministry of Health in Gaza claims that over 46,600 Palestinians have been killed since the start of the conflict. Now, since the ministry is run by Hamas, that figure can't be taken at face value. Indeed, it's a practical certainty that it contains thousands of Hamas combatants. Still, when all the relevant qualifications have been made, the suffering of civilians in Gaza remains appalling in kind and massive in scale. But that, in my opinion, is not sufficient to make it immorally disproportionate. Let me take a poll around the table. Which of you, all things considered, thinks that the prosecution of the war against Hitler in 1939 to 45 was morally justified? Can you raise your hand? And those of you, you can't abstain, so those of you who don't think it was justified, can you raise your hand? Okay, so you are typical, certainly a typical Anglo-Saxon audience, right? And yet Allied warfare inflicted huge cost upon civilians. One conservative estimate has it that British and American bombers killed over 350,000 non-combatants in Germany. Air raids over France are supposed to have killed 70,000 French civilians, 30,000 during the crucial Normandy campaign alone. Anyone still unaware of the human cost of defeating Hitler should read James Holland's latest book, The Savage Storm, which chronicles 12 months, 1943, of that 5-year war in one place, Italy. Old men, women and children suffered grievously from the Allied invasion, torn apart by bombs and shells, exposed to the wintry elements by the destruction of their homes, and starved of food and water. The British and Americans had no desire, no intention to inflict such suffering. They were often horrified by the effects of their warfare, and they sought to provide relief where they could. But their overriding and unrelenting priority was, understandably, military victory over the Nazis, which in 1943 was not assured. They could have chosen tactics that would have reduced the risk to civilians. In Italy in 1943, as in Normandy the following year, the Allies relied heavily on bombing and artillery so as to preserve the lives of combat soldiers in the front. Had they abandoned that tactic, fewer non-combatants would have died, but victory would have been jeopardized. By the end of that year, instead of the standard 3-to-1 numerical superiority reckoned necessary for success, the invading Allies could only muster one attacker for every one German defender, and the British were beginning to run out of manpower altogether. I know because my father was there, and he was in an anti-aircraft unit, and his unit was disbanded in order to provide stretcher bearers and supply carriers on the front, because there were no other men to employ. The dreadful truth, and it is a dreadful truth, is that the prosecution of war almost invariably involves civilian casualties, usually very, very many of them. And when there are good enough reasons to fight for fighting in the first place, those casualties may be tragically justified. And that's why the laws of war, as traditionally understood, do not forbid the killing of non-combatants as such. They only forbid their intentional and disproportionate killing. That's to say, the objective must be a military one, and the harm done civilians incidental to the military purpose, and no greater than necessary to achieve it, given the means available. The Israeli Defense Force does have a reputation for being extraordinarily scrupulous in its choice of military targets and its minimization of risk to civilians. And it has a technological capacity for precision in targeting that was not available to the British and Americans 80 years ago. Of course, it's quite right that the IDF's actions should be scrutinized for evidence that it is imposing harm on civilians disproportionate to intended military objectives. To demonstrate disproportion, however, would require specialist military expertise and a close knowledge of the facts on the ground. And I've not yet come across any claim that Israel's military actions have been disproportionate, which displays the requisite expert knowledge. However, there is one point where Israel might be vulnerable to the charge. To be fully justified, military means should be apt to the political end, the ultimate political end, of securing a sufficiently just peace. Military strategy needs to be integrated into a larger political strategy. And it's not clear to me that Israel has a political strategy to resolve the century-long conflict with the descendants of those Palestinian Arabs who were displaced from their homes in the first half of the 20th century. In 2012, a documentary film, The Gatekeepers, which you can find online, was first broadcast, comprising in-depth interviews with 6 former heads of Shin Bet, the Israeli Internal Security Service. The very first segment bears the telling title, No Strategy, Just Tactics. Because one after another, the former security chiefs said in effect, we're in the business of stamping out potential fires, preventing terrorist attacks, and we've been doing that forever. But the problem is, there is no political strategy, just military tactics. Benjamin Netanyahu was Prime Minister of Israel then, and has remained so since. In the past decade, it is not obvious to me that his government has developed a strategy for peace beyond the crude one advocated by the militant Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky in 1923. Jabotinsky candidly admitted that Jewish and Arab claims upon Palestine were irreconcilable. His solution? That a Jewish state should erect an iron wall against which the Arabs would eventually tire of knocking their heads. Then they would compromise and make peace. But it seems to me that Hamas's atrocious assault in October 2023 has proven Jabotinsky terribly wrong. Far from making them tired, 100 years of fruitless headbanging have made some Palestinians insanely, nihilistically violent. If Israel wants peace, it will need more than an iron wall. And if its military action in Gaza is to be fully justified, according to just war criteria, it must want peace. So let me sum up what I've said in 4 main points. First of all, we should cease thinking of proportionality in terms of a weighing up of costs and benefits, because those are both incommensurable and unpredictable. Instead, second, we should think of it in terms of the aptness of military means to military and ultimately political ends or goals. It follows, third, that there is no absolute number of military or civilian deaths that is disproportionate. However, fourth and finally, military or civilian casualties unnecessary for the achievement of a military goal or subversive of the ultimate political goal, and which are caused carelessly and without due diligence, should be considered disproportionate. Thank you very much.